sections that I haven't read before on tour because somebody just asked me how many cities I've done. I don't know. I think all in all, the whole tour is 26 cities, and this is the last week. So quite a few. And so I've been so thankful to people for turning out to. I've only done independent bookstores, of course, and I wouldn't have a career without independent bookstores. So thank you all for being at an independent bookstore. I was first published 21 years ago, and independent booksellers have given me a career, so I'm very thankful to them. Um, and I'm starting to lose my voice because I've been on book tour so long, and because it's allergy season. Um, I I am from Kentucky. You may can tell that by my accent. I don't know. Um, and so I've never been to Minneapolis before, and I'll only get to be here about 18 hours, but it's beautiful. All I have been able to see is the Mary Tyler Moore statue so far, but I enjoyed that and took lots of pictures of it. Um, so, to tell you a little bit about Lark Ascending, um, this is a book born out of grief, and ultimately for me, it is about grief and finding your way through grief by homing in on the moments of beauty and light and hope that carry us through. But in 2015, I lost my aunt, who was a third parent to me. I have a really wonderful mother and father, but my aunt always lived within a half a mile. And for most of my childhood, she lived right next door. And she was very different than my parents. My parents were very strict, conservative. Um, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, which is very strict, fundamentalist, um, a church really rooted in judgment, most of all. So my aunt was very critical of the church, whereas my parents were very immersed in the church. Um, and so she would sneak and take me to things that that my parents wouldn't have taken me to, like the movies or trick or treating or a carnival or a ball game or a dance, or things like that. So it was wonderful to have that balance of her, that she gave me a much more complex childhood experience. And, she was just a real touchstone for me. So when I lost her, it just shattered me in a way that I didn't know was possible. Um, I had never experienced profound grief. I had never lost anybody really close to me. And so it was, I had to learn how to navigate that. The way I have always dealt with everything is by writing about it, writing through it. And so that's what I did. The other part of this that led to this novel is that the day after her funeral, I had to get on a plane and go to Ireland because I was contracted to be a writing residence at the National University of Ireland at Galway. And so I had to go. It was really hard to leave my family and everything familiar to me, the day after we buried my aunt. But at the same time, once I got there, Ireland was a real balm for me. And I had been to Ireland, I was familiar with it. Um, but I did a tremendous amount of walking while I was there. And at one point on my walk, I was joined by a little sheepdog who just sort of showed up. And he walked with me for about 2 miles. And, I sat down with him. He looked me right in the eye. And it was just, I don't know, as if he had showed up when I needed him the most. So I got home. I continued to, go through my grief. I'm trying to write about it every way I can and just sort of jot down whatever the world has given me. And this book starts to come to me. And one thing that I realize is going to be part of it is a man and a dog walking across Ireland. I just have to figure out how to, build a book around that. I have that image and have that idea, but and then I also know that they're both grief stricken, and I have to figure out their stories, their backstories that lead to that grief and that moment of them walking together across Ireland. So if you've read the book, you'll know that it's about halfway through before we get to them walking together across Ireland. So I had to build everything before, then walking together, and everything after. Um, Usually, I have the beginning and the end, and I have to create the middle. But in this case, I had that central point, and I had to create a beginning and end for them. And so the book is set about 20 years in the future. Um, and it's sort of my nightmare scenario of where things might go if we continue on our path of climate change and the demise of our democracy. And so a climate catastrophe has sort of helped to fuel a fundamentalist uh, insurrection, overtaking of the government. And people are on the run for their lives. Anybody who is different from the regime that's in control. And at the same time, they're on the run from this climate catastrophe that's happening. And that leads Lark's family to be on a refugee boat headed to Ireland. Um, and they're trying to seek sanctuary there. They've been told there's a safe place there called Glendalough. And so they're aiming for Glendalough, trying to get there. Hello.
Hello.
Just in time. I'm just getting ready to read. And so in this scene, they've made it across the Atlantic after a really treacherous journey across the ocean. And so I'm just going to drop you right into that boat here. Morning, white light, calm waters, the peaceful sound of the ocean nipping sweetly at the boat. Above me, a clear sky. Once there was a bluish purple flower in the Maine woods my mother had shown me. Anemone, she had said, sliding the stem between two fingers so she could cup it in her hand without picking the bloom. I loved the word and used to repeat it to myself when I tried to go to sleep. I had not thought of that in a long while, but that morning I did because the sky was anemone blue. I said the word aloud, 4 syllables, 4 prayers, to the sky, to the word itself, to the flower. And birds, gulls. We had not seen birds in ages. Here was an entire flock crying and wheeling, caught up in a frantic gossip as if they had missed seeing people. My mother slept the sleep of pure exhaustion beside me. I raised up, amazed by the sight of the birds. I didn't know how she could have slept through their clamor. I nudged her and didn't take my eyes away from the gulls. Birds, I said, feeling like that was the only word I could conjure. She sat up and put a hand to her brow. Ireland, she breathed out, even though there was nothing but miles of ocean before us. The birds mean we're close. Of the 44 of us when we left America, there were now 19, 17 of those children. We first saw land as twilight whispered itself into being. First there was the strange smudge on the horizon, then shape. After a time, we thought that our eyes were conjuring land, but the closer we got, the greener the island became, until it was a glowing green. Closer, and we could see the high cliffs through our binoculars. The Covenant plowed a straight line through the infinite ocean as she made her way toward land. As the sunset stained the western horizon, we could see more. 3 small islands off to the right, a very white lighthouse standing on one of the high bluffs, a scattering of houses over there close to the shore. No people anywhere. About a mile out there came the sound waves, which caused us all to cower in place, clutching our heads between our hands. The pain was excruciating, causing a tremor through our muscles and bones. A buzz set up residence in my teeth that would not leave for a couple of days. Then, even worse, there was a huge explosion in the water near us. Fire and water tangled together and shot into the sky next to the boat. Then, the nip, nip, nip of the bullets singing through the air all around us, immediately accompanied by screams and high cries. I picked up the child, Charlotte, and she latched her small legs around my waist, her fingers sinking into my shoulders. She buried her face in the hollow place of my neck. It's all right, I said, even though clearly it was not. Don't be afraid. And so, like I said, I just wanted to drop you into the situation at hand, what's going on. Um, Even though the book is set in about 20 years from now and is speculative in nature, I never really thought of it as an apocalypse story or a dystopian story. I was thinking of it more as an adventure story, and so I hope you get the sense of that in that scene. And since it's set 20 years in the future, it's really 20 years in the future is much more like the past than it is like our idea of the future because it's a post electricity world. It's a world where most of the population has been decimated and people are living in very small communities. And so, because of that, I looked to books for influence that are from the far past. So, especially books like the works of Robert Louis Stevenson and Jack London. And so, I wanted the narrative voice to have that sort of timeless quality to the way it's being told. This sort of old fashioned. The frame is a 90-year-old man who's on his deathbed, and he's telling you the story of when he was 20 years old, and he and his family made this transatlantic journey and ended up in Ireland, and he's the only survivor of the boat, um, to his knowledge. And so, in writing the book, I mean, obviously, I've never been in a refugee boat across the Atlantic and all that. Not had to run for my life yet as an American. Um, but I did draw on a lot of autobiographical elements because I thought, how would I react in this situation? And one thing that I thought a lot about was I've always had not really a fear, but a deep hatred of being alone. I don't like being alone. I was raised in a house full of lots of people and lots of cousins, and everybody was just always coming through our house. Nobody ever knocked, and the porches were always full and all that. And so I think now I need a lot of people around because of that. Even if I want to be alone and writing, I really like it if the house is full of people, and I can hear the murmur in the next room, even if I'm alone. That I find that comforting. And so Lark is alone for a lot of this book, and he's very lonesome and very afraid. And so eventually, he is sort of saved because he meets a dog. And there aren't many dogs left in the world because things are not good, and pets are, there are not many pets around. In fact, there's a whole backstory to that as well, that I won't get into. But when he finds this dog, he's very surprised. He thinks that it may be the only dog in Ireland. And so, after he meets Seamus, the dog, who is a beagle who has been trained to not bark. And I know that that's hard to believe, a quiet beagle. But he has been trained to be quiet, and that's the only way he's survived. And I just so happen to have a very quiet beagle, which sounds like an oxymoron, right? But I mean, we leave him in hotel rooms all the time, and he never makes a sound. He never howls or bays, is what we call it, or even whines loudly. And so I based Seamus on my beagle. Um, and so I'm going to read you a little scene that takes place um, at the same time of what I just read to you. Seamus is on one of those islands, and so this is from Seamus's point of view, as some of the chapters in the book are. Seamus watched. He started at every explosion, scurried back over the dune, each time fire snipped at the water, each time the very air expanded almost to bursting. Yet he always returned to watch the girl thrashing about in the water. When all the young people had swum at the beach, he had always gone with them, splashing in after each one who waded far enough out to disappear beneath the water. Sometimes they had yelled harshly at him to hush when he barked at the waves. But then they'd laugh and hug him around the neck and say he was a good lad for swimming in after everyone. He whined a little, although he had been well trained to not make a sound, not one, as he watched her swimming toward the shore. She only brought her face up enough to draw in air, then she sank back down again, taking wide strokes with her arms. He bounded down the shore and ran out into the water until he was deep enough to go afloat. The iciness of it caused a thrill to run all through him. The waves came over his small head and pushed him back toward the island, but it was not in Seamus's nature to give up, so he kept on straight for her. Behind her, the last of the boat disappeared without a sound, and Seamus knew that was that. She was still so far away, and now shunts of pain were running down his back legs the way they did on the coldest days, but he kept swimming. She went completely still, but then she took a great shuddering breath. As he reached her, she wrapped her arms around his neck, which caused the both of them to go under. He thought she might sink them both completely, but finally she let go and she was tugging at his collar to bring him back up. Now she held on more tenderly. The two of them treaded water, and then he pulled her back toward the island. She held on to him with one hand, kicking at the water with what strength she had. Then he felt her let go. He turned and she was stumbling up out of the surf, hunched over and throwing up seawater, then lying half in the water and half on the sand, taking great gulps of air. The tracer fire started again, kicking up little clicks of sand all around him. One of the bullets hit her, and she fell back as if her shoulders had suddenly been nailed to the beach. He ran for the dunes, and then he realized this was not his island. He had gotten turned around in the water, and now they were on the mainland. In fact, he could see the sturdy back of his own island rising up out of the ocean before him. He could see the very house where he and his man had lived. He spun and ran, diving into the black rocks along the shore. Bits of the rocks exploded and pinged around him. And then the soldiers were dragging her away up the path in the black rocks. They pulled her up the rise as her heels dragged the ground. He sat hidden in a pocket of wet rocks and watched. He knew he had to be completely silent. His man had taught him that. Now there were only the sounds of the waves and the unzipping hum of the machine pods that swooped over the water. But there was no one now. Once again, Seamus was all alone. And so Seamus's old man has passed away, and Seamus is alone in the world too. So he's very glad to come upon Lark, and they form this alliance, and they walk across Ireland trying to get to Glendalough. And along the way, they encounter another person, Helen, who's a character I really loved writing. And they all are trying to trust each other, and they are all in deep grief. And so I was just trying to write out of that thing that I knew best at the time. A writer should write what they know best, and that's what I knew best. And in the process, I sort of realized that I was not only writing about my own grief, but I was writing about this collective grief that a lot of us have been going through for the past several years as we witness so much sadness, whether it be what we feel like is the demise of our democracy, or school shootings, or widespread cases of, widely seen cases of police brutality that we've all witnessed together. So much waves of sadness that we've gone through, the pandemic, etc. And so I wanted to write about a sort of national kind of grief like that. But the only way to do that is to create, a human story. And in this case, the biggest human story plays out between a human and a dog. And I really loved writing some chapters from the points of view of the dog. As you can see, it's a dark story. There's violence, there's necessary violence, necessary darkness. But what I tried to do is every time it got really incredibly dark, I pulled back to the light and to the hope. And I was always trying to find the hopeful strain in a story like this. And one thing that enabled me to do that was the dog, because the dog is a joyful creature unless it's been taught to be otherwise. Also, the dog's perspective was a real challenge to write. I had to really rely on the sense of smell more than anything else. And I feel like I'm a pretty sensory writer all the time. I'm always drawing on the five senses: see, hear, taste, feel, smell. But as a novelist, you're usually drawing mostly on on what you see, on the scene. In this case, with the dog, I tried to draw mostly on what he's smelling and tasting. So I thought it would be a unique challenge to also do that with my human character. And so he relies a lot on aromas as well. And for instance, the scent of cedar is very important to him throughout the book. And it's sort of the smell of the love of his life and enables him to carry the scent of Arlo with him, because he can run his hand down a cedar tree and conjure this lost love that he has. So those are a few things I was thinking as I wrote the novel. So I hope you might be curious about other things about it. Yes.
Yeah, but I'm actually a little curious about how is it your how I'm just an aspiring novelist myself, and I was actually wondering if what's like the biggest factor in world building from your book?
Just in case the internet can't hear the questions about what is the biggest part of the process of world building for the book.
Yes.
Um, well, even books that are set in the real world, for me, you still have to do world building, right? Even if it's not set in the future, or even if it's not fantasy or whatever, you still have to world build. For me, it's just immersing myself in that world as much as I can and really thinking about all five senses and heightening my own senses and trying to create that world for myself as much as I can. One way that I always create the world for myself is that I think about the music of that world, the musical landscape. And so, of course, I was listening to a lot of Irish music. I was listening to a lot of music about the sea, the ocean. Um, I listened to songs about dogs. Each of my characters has a theme song. Um, my lead character's theme song is the one I love by REM, which is, a song of deep grief and longing for the person you love the most. The dog's theme song is I Love My Dog by Cat Stevens, which the whole lyric is I love my dog more than I love you. So it's Cat Stevens, singing to an ex about loving his dog more than anybody else. And it just perfectly captures the rhythm of a dog trotting. Um, I also read a lot of poetry that really fed the novel, like poems about Ireland, poems about the ocean, poems about grief. I read a lot of nonfiction about grief, stages of grief, things of that nature. Also, I walked the entire journey that my character walks in Ireland. And, not everybody can do that, but you can still replicate that in ways. So even when I wasn't walking in Ireland, I was always walking every day. And, I would like, I don't know, if I would be walking and I would feel a root under my shoe sole, I would think I need to do that every once in a while in the book. I need to have him feel the ground under his feet. Or I would think about specific flora and fauna and what made me notice it, and that's the same that would make him notice in the book, and things like that. So I think that you can just, yeah, I call that method writing. It's sort of like, we've all heard of method acting. I don't know, like Robert De Niro gained, 50 pounds to play a particular role, and then he would lose 80 pounds to play another role or something like that. I mean, that's method acting. I do those same things with writing. I sort of, if my character's experiencing something like that, I try to do it too. But those are just some things that work for me.
You're writing this book that's fairly dark, and you're in a time of grief. Did it help you get to a place of light at the end?
Did writing this book help me to get to a place of light in this moment of darkness for me? Yes. Mostly because I felt like something positive was coming out of my grief. Like I was able to create a piece of art out of my grief. So I couldn't imagine anything much better than that. As somebody who has a deep need to create art, I'm not happy unless I am creating something. I've never treated my writing like therapy, and And I really caution people to do that. However, I think it can be therapeutic, if that makes sense. Um, and so it also made me think about, like, in this situation of catastrophe, the world, the government's collapsed, the grid has gone down. It made me think about what is really, really important. And what's really important is having the people that you love with you. That's all, really. That's that's what it all boils down to, is that you and the people you love are safe. And so that's what it keeps coming back to, is him trying to do that. The other thing is he realizes that the most important thing for him in this scenario is to retain his humanity, to try to keep being the best person he can be in the most extreme circumstances. And so, he's constantly having to make these ethical decisions because he's in such an extreme situation. But at the same time, we do that every day, really. We have to make these, little private ethical decisions all throughout the day, if we really think about it. And it's just all heightened because of this, terrific situation that he's in. Sure.
Were you leading Lark and Seamus, or were Seamus and Lark leading you through this story?
That's a great question. Were my characters leading me, or was I leading them? My characters always lead me. I spend a lot of time creating the characters and really getting to know who they are. Usually I would say getting to know who they are as human beings, but in this case, the dog is such an important part of the book. I'll just say creating the characters, but even the dog, I had to know who he was. He had to have a really distinct personality. And, a big part of his personality is he's grieving the loss of his first person. And he feels really grateful to have met another good person to take up with. And so there's a hinge in the book where all throughout the book, he refers back to his old man. And then there's a moment in the book where he starts to refer to his young man, and it's a turning point in the book. And I love that moment. And I remember when that happened, it was just an organic thing that showed up.
And I just marked that page.
Oh, yeah? That's my favorite page of the book.
Yes. So much.
Unfortunately, I can't read that page because it gives something really important away, but that's my favorite. I think it's page 250 or 255. 250. When you get to 250, remember that's my favorite page. That's my favorite passage in the book. So I spend a lot of time creating the characters, and then I start writing the book, and then the characters sort of lead me to what's the way they react to situations. That becomes the plot. That's the best thing I've learned as a writer, and that's what works for me. Some people, have to write down the whole plot. I think the main thing I always want writers to know is that no one writer's way is going to work for you, but it's really good to ask writers what they do, and then you try that out, and if it doesn't work for you, it's okay. And then you move on to the next thing that might work for you, and eventually you'll sort of find your own way that works, Other questions?
Did you have the idea for the book before you went to Ireland, or did it come to you in Ireland?
It didn't come to me until I had come home from Ireland. Like, I'd had that whole experience. But even when I was in Ireland, I started taking notes, and I just felt so deeply connected to Ireland that I thought I would eventually write about it, and so I was taking a lot of notes. And then I went back a couple times while I was writing the book as well. I was, I'm really lucky that I have really close friends in Ireland, and so I'm able to go there pretty easily, because lodging is the biggest part of travel. But it just, it just took up residence in me, and I needed to write about it. Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you were raised Pentecostal. How did that influence you in any way in writing this?
how did being raised Pentecostal influence me in any way in writing this book? When you're raised in, fundamentalism, I mean, it just influences everything. I left the church when I was about 16. It's hard to talk about because it's complicated, because there were good things about the church too, and I never want to say it was just all bad. I think we tend to talk more about a situation like that. We talk more about the damage, and the damage in a way shapes you more. But I did feel really loved and really safe. But the problem was I knew that if they knew who I really was, that they wouldn't love me anymore, or at least they wouldn't act on the love. So, as a little gay boy in a Pentecostal church, you know that someday you're going to be suspect, and that love is very easily extinguished in that sort of situation. And so I think all of my books to some degree are about what it means to be good, because that's been like one of the biggest questions in my life. That as a child I was taught that you must be good so you'll go to heaven. And then there became a point when I thought, no, you must be good because that's the right thing to do. Because that's what, if anything, while we're here, it's to be good to each other, and that's the only way you can have a real positive mark in the world. Not to gain a reward, but to be of service, And so I think I'm always writing about that. How do you do that properly? And I write a lot about guilt because, we talk a lot in our culture about Catholicism and guilt, but fundamentalism has that's a huge component in it too. And it's how it gets you to do everything that you do. It's how you obey is through the guilt. And so in this book, fundamentalist forces have risen up and they've taken over. It's not that far-fetched. I mean, I grew up in a really fringe church. Even the people I went to school with, even in my own community, snake handlers. People didn't handle snakes in my church, but everybody said we did, right? And but now the stuff that I heard in the pulpit growing up, I'm hearing it in Senate chambers and from people in Congress. So it's scary to see it. I have a essay coming out in Time next week about the rise of Christian nationalism and my fear of it because of growing up in it. Yeah. I think we have time for just one more question, and yes.
Have you ever published any short stories for any magazines?
Have I ever published short stories? Yes, I've published almost enough to put together a collection. So I think I've published maybe 7 or 8, and then I'm writing 2 or 3 more to go, to make a book. I can't even think where the last one I published is in a journal called Tri-Quarterly, which is out of Northwestern University, I believe. Ecotone is a journal that my short stories are in.
Have you ever thought maybe of publishing them?
Yeah, I want to publish them. I hope I can put a collection together soon of those for sure. I think that short stories are harder to write than novels are. It takes me almost as long to write a short story as it does a novel. I work on short stories for years sometimes, and sometimes 2 or 3 simultaneously. I'm working on for years. Are you a short story writer?
No, but I have actually published a couple of short stories before. They usually talk about 1 page.
Yeah. I identify much more as a novelist than as a short story writer, but occasionally I'll get a short story. Well, if any of you have questions you'd like to ask one-on-one, I'd love to answer them. I'd love to sign your books if you have them. Thank you so much for coming out on this pretty evening.